So welcome to the Faith and Global Engagement and the McDonald Distinguished Lecture Series. So my name is Steve, if we've not met. Actually, it's still Steve if we have met. So, but anyway, I'm Steve, and I'm one of the leaders at Faith and Global Engagement. So it's great to see all of you. Some new faces, some familiar faces, all coming together. And that's what these lecture series are really about, is kind of bringing together faculty, staff, students, and then leaders from the community to come together. So welcome. It's great to have you here tonight. And this is like Friday night, right? So if you're like me, maybe your week was a little bit tiring. It was a full week. And so what's in store for you is a treat because we have a great storyteller with us tonight. So on a Friday night, you can just kind of sit back, relax, immerse yourself in the story as Jennifer leads us. So I'm going to be introducing Jennifer in a little bit, but let me just tell you a little bit about the format of the night, because this is really intended as an exchange. So we'll start with Jennifer coming up and then sharing her story, her family story, giving her lecture. And as she's doing so, if there's questions or comments or anything that come to mind, then write those down. Because basically, when Jennifer has finished her lecture, then it's your turn. And we want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts, your comments, your ideas. And so following the lecture, we'll have a facilitated question and answer session where you can have a chance to share. We'll have roving mics for that. And then at the end, I'll just wrap up with some things where Faith and Global Engagement is presentations that are coming. Actually, we have one on next week as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the end about that. Sound okay? Sound good? All right, good. So let me introduce our guest speaker today, Jennifer Lin. So Jennifer Lin is an award-winning journalist and author and documentary filmmaker. Her document, Beethoven in Beijing, is actually going to have its Asian premiere here on Sunday at the University of Hong Kong, and our very own Daniel Chua will be moderating that. Daniel Chua is the founding director of Faith and Global Engagement. But it tells the story of 1973 of the Philadelphia Orchestra coming over to Beijing, and then all that's happened in those 50 years. You can kind of think it's a celebration of the 50 years, but you'll see that on Sunday here. So that's one of the documents. It's an award-winning, prize-winning documentary. She also has two other shorter documentaries. That one, I believe, has just been completed, and that is one called 10 Times Better, and then one that I believe is in the works called Beyond Yellow Face, which both look at kind of the Asian concepts in terms of the ballet and dancing. So two of those to be looking out for. For 31 years, Jennifer was a journalist with the Philadelphia Inquirer. And in that role, she spent almost 4 years in Beijing as a foreign correspondent, coming back and forth from Beijing to here in Hong Kong, here at the time of the handover. She was also in Washington, D.C. as a national correspondent for the National Enquirer, and also in Wall Street as a financial correspondent. So wealth of knowledge. You can ask her any questions when we come to the Q&A on any of those topics. But she's been in journalism for a long time. Tonight, she's going to tell the story of her family. Family over 5 generations of the Lin family. And the kind of in the backdrop of 19th and 20th century China and some of the developments back and forth in that. So that'll be her story here tonight. So let's give a warm welcome for Jennifer Lin as she comes forward.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve, for that warm welcome. But I do have to correct you on one thing. I worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I wasn't a sensationalist journalist for the National Enquirer, but it's a
That's a big difference. That's a huge difference.
But a common mistake. And I'm just thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to see so many people here on a Friday night. Thank you to Professor Daniel Chua for inviting me. We met a year ago when I gave this talk at the Museum of the Bible, so it led me here. And yesterday I met with journalism students from Hong Kong, University of Hong Kong, and I was telling them about storytelling. And I told them that sometimes you know immediately what your story is about, and sometimes you have to go through your entire reporting process before you know what the story is about. And that's really the case of my book, Shanghai Faithful. It took me many, many, many years to research and write this. And it was really when I got to the end of the process that I thought, my book, my family story, is really the story of Christianity in China, in the modern history of Christianity in modern China. And so really through my family, I think you'll get an understanding of how Christianity evolved over the past 150 years. So there's the book, and to begin with, this is my family. I'd like to use as a starting point the year 1972. And for American families like mine, that was a really important, pivotal year. My father left China in 1949. He was born in Shanghai and married my mother, an Italian nurse from Camden, New Jersey. But when Nixon went to China, it was such a game changer, not only on a geopolitical scale, but on a very personal scale for families like mine. So when my father left in 49 up until 1973, like the only way we could communicate was through letters. And we had to assume that every letter that was sent from China was read by the authorities, and every letter that we sent was also read. But after Nixon went to China, things began to ease a little bit. And in 1973, then, we were able actually to make a phone call for the first time and talk to my father's relatives in Shanghai. But the other pivotal year was 1978. So December 1978, President Carter formally renewed relations with China. What that meant is we opened an embassy in China, and China opened an embassy in Washington, and there were full diplomatic relations. So my father, by June, we were on a plane to go back to Shanghai to meet the relatives he had left behind. By then, his parents had passed away, but he had a sister and a brother who were still living in the family home in Shanghai. And for me, this was just such an incredible moment because I was able to meet all the relatives who were only names in letters and meet the first cousins, of mine. So it was just a marvelous experience. And my father, he got to see his family home, and that's where we stayed. But I'll never forget my first morning in China, because when I woke up, my father came down the stairs into the bedroom where we were staying, and I will never forget the look on his face. It was a look of utter shock and sadness. And he pulled me aside and he said, "My God, this is so depressing." Because the night before, when we had fallen asleep, there was an uncle who pulled my father aside and asked him, "Do you have any idea what happened to us since you've been gone?" And the truth of the matter was my father was clueless. We didn't know what had happened to the family. We didn't know, for instance, that my grandfather, who was an Anglican priest, that he had been stripped of most of his responsibilities. We didn't know what had happened to my father's uncle, Watchman Nee, and the degree of his problems. And we didn't know in particular what had happened to the family during the Cultural Revolution. So for my father, it was really a traumatic experience to learn all this on his first night back at home. And so, it kind of hung over us during the whole 2 weeks that we were there, and it turned this happy reunion into something quite different. What's really interesting is when we got back to Philadelphia, my father's a doctor, he was a surgeon, and he seemed to take what he had heard, put it in a box, and put it away, because he couldn't go back in time, he couldn't change anything that had happened to the family and make it better. But for me, it became what my father would later call my obsession. I needed to find out what happened to the family and why. I was 20 years old at the time, and I was already a reporter. So I was able to put my skills to good use. And over the course of the next 3 decades, I basically investigated my family's story as a reporter would. And I was in a good position to do that. I spent several years living in China for the Philadelphia Inquirer, reporting from there. This is, you know, my coming down to Hong Kong to write about the Hong Kong handover. I don't know if you could recognize that spot, but those are my children during one of our trips. And I really began mining my family history, which meant interviewing all the relatives who were, you know, still alive. You know, when we returned from Shanghai, that first trip in 1979, I sat my father down and I said, "Dad, tell me the family history." And I began also interviewing all of my relatives. I visited archives around the world, including here in Hong Kong. And I was in Birmingham, England, Yale University, University of Pennsylvania, the Anglican archives in Austin, Texas. And I really, you know, just began building the family history. I visited sites from our story that were important. This is the burial site for my great-grandfather in Fuzhou. And I found that for every answer that I had, there was another question. And so it began pushing me further and further into the past. And my grandparents were both third-generation Christians. So that led to the question, well, they're third generation. Who was the first? And I remember telling this to a friend of mine, how, you know, my grandparents were third-generation Christians in China. And she asked me, she said, well, why would anyone in China convert in the first place? So again, this really pushed me to the beginning of my story. And it took me to Fujian province. And my branch of the Lin family is from a small fishing village called Ardu. It's like an hour or so north of Fuzhou. And so what I found out through family lore and also by going to the Lin Ancestral Hall is the first convert was my great-great-grandfather, who I'm going to simply refer to as Old Lin. And what family lore had was that he left this little village carrying his son in a basket strung across his shoulders, and that he left his village under some duress and ended up in Fuzhou. And he ended up working for the missionaries as a cook. So most likely back then it would have been a man named Archdeacon John Wolfe, who was known as the Moses of Fujian. And so my great-great-grandfather was working for the missionaries, and he had converted to Christianity. The missionaries, the Anglican missionaries, did a lot of work in remote villages of Fujian. They didn't, Archdeacon Wolfe didn't just concentrate on the cities. So the fisherman had a son, the son he carried on his back, and his name was Lin Tao An. This is the local spelling of it. And he became a doctor because the fisherman who ended up as a cook sent his son, his only son, to a school run by the missionaries. And they trained him to be a doctor. He didn't go to medical school, but he became a medical assistant. And he was working in a small hospital in a town known then as Funing. And in writing my book, in researching my family history, I really had to rely a lot on the missionaries to tell me about their experiences. So for like the generation that's still alive, I was able to talk to them, to interview them, but to know what the life was like for the fisherman cook and for my great-grandfather, the doctor, I relied on the missionaries. And luckily for me, they were part of the Anglican Church. And the Anglicans were incredible record keepers and did a fabulous job of communicating with the Home Office back in England as to what was happening. So here you'll see, this is an obituary, really, a tribute to my great-grandfather, written by his mentor, Dr. Birdwood von Simmeren Taylor. And in this, he's describing my great-grandfather and the fact that he spoke English, which was really unusual. But in the little hospital where he worked in Funing, I learned, again from the missionary writing, that 2/3 of the patients were opium addicts. Now think about that. 2/3 of the patients were suffering from opium addiction. And the missionaries in Funing would complain that they're often met with such resistance from the people because they're often told, you know, you come here with your opium and destroy our lives, and then you try to save us with your Bible. So, you know, this was a real hurdle for all of the missionaries in China. This photograph, I included it because it was just sent to me about 2 months ago from a researcher in China, and he found this in the Anglican archives, and it shows my great-grandfather standing there in the middle row, second row in the middle. And he sent this to me. He said, I believe this is your great-grandfather, and it's correct. So this is from the little hospital in Funing. The missionaries were great matchmakers, you know, and they introduced the doctor to a teacher. And this is my great-grandmother, Zhang Naomei, and she was born in a small village in Fujian. And she was born the year of a great famine in China. For whatever reasons, her parents let the missionaries take her to a school to educate her. And, you know, that was really pretty revolutionary. If she had stayed in the small village where she was born, her life would have started and ended in that same village. But because she had an education, because she was exposed to education, she was able to move to Fuzhou and meet my great-grandfather, the doctor. So they had 10 children, 6 of whom survived childhood, and the oldest was my grandfather, Lin Buqi. And my grandfather was the eldest son and benefited from all the educational opportunities that were afforded him in the city of Fuzhou. He was one of the first students, he was 12 years old, and there was an Irish priest by the name of Reverend William Pakenham Walsh, and he started a school for boys called St. Mark's in Fuzhou. And what was special about this school is the language of education was English. So from the age of 12, my grandfather was taught in English. This little school, St. Mark's, went on to become Trinity College, which was a very well-known school in Fuzhou. And my grandfather was very precocious, very intelligent, and he was then sent by the missionaries to St. John's University, where he excelled and he got his degree in English. He was a member of the debate team, and one of the students who was a year older than him and frankly better at debate was Lin Yutang, the famous philosopher. So it was a heady time to be a student at St. John's University. My grandfather was part of this generation of men and women who really had this sense of pride in China. But they also knew that for China to advance at that period, that they needed to have an education, a Western education. So like many of his generation, my grandfather was able to come to the United States to study. He went to Philadelphia to go to the seminary that was in Philadelphia, the Episcopal Seminary, and to enroll at the University of Pennsylvania. So what's really interesting is, you know, as I tell you about my family story, I'd also like to share with you just some of my research methods. And so to find out more about my grandfather, I went to a very exclusive site called Ancestry.com. It is absolutely amazing what you can find on Ancestry.com. And if you haven't checked it out, I advise you to go and take a look at it. So I did, and what I found was the ship manifest that had my grandfather's arrival into the United States in 1918. He left Shanghai in August of 1918 on the SS Nanking. And I was able to find the manifest, and I counted up the passengers. And in the manifest, they have to say, you know, what your profession is and where you're from. So in counting up the number of students, it was remarkable. So of 594 passengers, 149 were Chinese men and women going to universities in the United States. And there was also a book that they used to publish called Who's Who Among Chinese American Students. So I was able to find out where they were going. And they were going to like Michigan, University of California, but they were also going to a lot of small liberal arts schools like Oberlin or Beloit. And so there was also a celebrity on the boat among the passengers. Xu Zhimo was one of the poet was one of the passengers. So my grandfather ended up in Philadelphia, as I said. He arrived in Philadelphia in September of 1918. Just a little fun fact, he arrived just as the pandemic was breaking out. And Philadelphia in 1918, the influenza pandemic was a real hot spot. People were dying everywhere. And that's when my grandfather arrived in Philadelphia. He enrolled in the seminary, and he was also a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. His plan was to spend as much time as he could in the United States, earning his doctorate in theological studies as well as philosophy at Penn. That was the plan. I went to the University of Pennsylvania to look up his transcript because I was curious. And when I pulled up this document, I absolutely gasped when I saw it, because my grandfather's address was 901 Clinton Street, which is a beautiful little street in Center City, Philadelphia. It's 2 blocks long. There's someone in the audience from Philadelphia, so Drew, it's right near Pennsylvania Hospital. And it was where I lived. We were neighbors, many decades apart, but my grandfather was at 901 Clinton Street and I was at 920 Clinton Street. So to me, that was a sign. He was telling me, keep going, Jennifer. So my grandfather, a little more than a year into his stay in Philadelphia, he was thriving, by the way. He was just, very involved with the Chinese Student Association. He was treasurer of the national body, but he got a telegram from home. And his father told him, your younger brother is getting married, but before he gets married, you have to be married because you're the oldest son. So I found someone for you to marry. Come home. And so for my grandfather, again, he's this man of the 1918 generation. He was going to change China. He was going to get his doctorate and drink up all the education that he could. This created a real dilemma, a real crisis. Would he be a modern man and pursue his plan, or would he be a dutiful son, a Confucian son? And so, of course, he was the dutiful son. And he left Philadelphia after earning just his master's in philosophy from Penn and graduating. And he returned home to marry a woman he barely knew. And she was, by the way, she wasn't thrilled either that they had to get married, because she was going to the McTeer School in Shanghai and loving it. And my grandmother had aspirations too. My grandfather wasn't the only one with a plan. Her plan, like many young Chinese women at the time, was to become a doctor, because there were many Christian female doctors who were very famous at the time. And so she wanted to come to the United States and study. So she had to thwart her studies at McTeer and return to Fuzhou for this arranged marriage. So although they're smiling in that picture, neither of them was very happy to be there. But this marriage joined 2 families, the Lin family and the Nee families of Fuzhou. And the Nee families were also very prominent. This is the matriarch of the clan, Lin Heping. No relation to my grandfather, that Lin. But my grandmother was her second daughter. And her first son, the 3rd child in the family, was someone who became known as Watchman Nee. Watchman Nee would become one of the leading Chinese religious figures of the 20th century. So the marriage brought these 2 families together. When my grandfather returned to Fuzhou, he really was a rising star. He was teaching at the seminary. He was named the new dean of a cathedral they were building in Fuzhou. And he was really a prominent person in the Anglican community. But that really created some problems in 1927. As you'll recall from your history, that was the Northern Expedition. And so as the nationalists and the communist forces were heading north, and battling the warlords, when they got to Fuzhou, they easily succeeded. But what happened during this period is there was a lot of anti-Western sentiment. There was a strong sense of nationalism and patriotism among the Chinese people. My grandfather also felt this spirit of pride in being Chinese. But what happened to him during 1927 was a revelation to me. Now, again, another aside on my research methods. I am a journalist and a writer. I'm not a scholar. But I relied on scholarly work to write my story. My story is told as narrative nonfiction as a story, but everything is based on research. So whenever I read a book, whenever I start a book, I start with the index, because I want to see if there's any mention of my grandfather, Lin Puji, or Watchman Nee. So Ryan Dunch is a scholar in Canada, and he wrote a magnificent book called Fuzhou Protestants and the Making of Modern China. And so I went to the back of the book, and lo and behold, there was an entry for my grandfather, Lin Puji. So I turned to the page, and he had basically one sentence saying, the Chinese principal of an Anglican school, the Reverend Lin Puji, was capped and paraded through the streets, then denounced at a mass meeting. Ryan was describing a protest that happened in 1927, where the protesters were, attacking Westerners and also Chinese who were affiliated with Westerners. And so this is all Ryan wrote, but the reporter in me started asking, well, wait a second. If this caught the attention of Ryan, I wonder if I could find other accounts of what happened to my grandfather, because this was all news to me. And what I found was just, multiple descriptions of an event involving my grandfather. There were mentions of this in missionary magazines, diplomatic reports. The British government had a consulate in Fuzhou, so I went to the archives in London and found, descriptions of what happened during this day in March 1927. The newspapers had accounts of this. In fact, I was at the Hong Kong University's library looking through the North China Daily to find a Reuters story that actually mentioned the attack on my grandfather. And then there were internal missionary letters that I was able to locate, which also described this event, and diaries. This is the Reuters report that I found here, in your archives. And as they describe, serious anti-Christian agitation has been started here by communist students who held a meeting yesterday at which the speakers harangued the mob, urging to overthrow Christianity. The students seized and bound a Chinese pastor, and after placing a fool's cap on his head, paraded him through the foreign quarter past British and American mission buildings. So in some of the letters that I found, one was from this American who was president of Fujian Christian University, and he wrote, they asked him, my grandfather, if he was a Christian, to which he said yes. Then they said they would free him if he would renounce his faith, to which he replied, I will never renounce my faith. You may kill me if you want. His mentor, my grandfather's mentor, was this Irish priest, Reverend Pakenham Walsh. And at the Princeton library, I found a very thin memoir that he wrote called My 20 Years in China. I pulled out this book from the shelf at the Princeton Theological Seminary, and I opened it up, and there was a picture of my grandfather, in Fuzhou, surrounded by all these children, and a chapter on him entitled My Favorite Students. And in this memoir, Reverend Pakenham Walsh quotes from a letter my grandfather wrote to him describing what happened to him in March of 1927. And according to Pakenham Walsh, what he wrote was that my grandfather said this was purely a Chinese affair and he wished to fight it out himself. This was after some Americans offered to help him as they're parading him through the streets of Fuzhou. He began to pray in silence for the mob of students round about him, and from that moment he said, "All fear left my heart." And he spoke out quietly and boldly that Christianity was not a foreign faith, but the completion of all that the great Chinese sages had looked forward to, and that he would never deny his Lord and Master. So what's really remarkable to me is not only how my grandfather comported himself during this. So again, he was captured by this mob that was really just looking for someone, and they happened upon him. And because he was so associated with the Anglican Church, he was almost like a sitting duck. And so then they spent the whole day parading him through the streets. They had a dunce cap on his head and a rope around his neck, hauling him around like a dog on a leash. But what was equally as remarkable as that is the fact that no one in my family knew this. Not my father, not his brothers, not his sister. No one knew this fact. And if it wasn't for looking at the index in Ryan Dunch's book, I wouldn't have known. But to me, this was just such an important moment in his life. I have my theories as to why he didn't say anything, but to me, what this incident spoke of is just the depth of his faith. So, oops, going the wrong way. So my grandfather became the president of Trinity College in 1928 because there was an effort to transition the administration of institutions in Fuzhou to local Chinese. And so he replaced the British principal and became the first Chinese principal of president of Trinity College in Fuzhou. But my grandfather was a man who didn't suffer fools lightly, and he was a bit of a divisive character, and some people loved him and some people didn't. And really, Fuzhou became too small of a city for him. And he moved the family in 1932 to Shanghai. He spent a year in Kaifeng at a middle school, but then an opportunity arose in Shanghai, and he moved the family to Shanghai in 1932 at probably the worst possible time, because these were years of constant conflict. And in 1932, Japan had bombed a neighborhood in Shanghai, Hangzhou, and that's precisely where my grandfather moved them. They were a block from the Japanese garrison. But my father remembers just growing up in Shanghai, and there was just constant conflict. The Sino-Japanese War, followed by the Second World War, followed by the Chinese Civil War. But my grandfather, found good work, and in Shanghai, he was pastor of St. Peter's Church, which was a very famous church within Shanghai because it was very much self-supporting. It was not reliant on missionary funds. And so he was the assistant pastor. He was editor of a publication called The Chinese Churchman, which was published by the Anglican Church. And he also was principal of a school for Chinese boys, which was run by the Shanghai Municipal Council. It was basically a way of earning a salary. By moving to Shanghai, my family became close to my grandmother's brother, Watchman Nee, who after the family moved to the international settlement, this would have been like 1935, they became neighbors. Watchman Nee literally lived on the other side of Jiaozhou Road from my family. And this was a period of, Watchman Nee's, he was really building a following of people in the 1930s. He was at the height of his popularity. And there was a very large Christian assembly in Shanghai, as well as in other cities around China. What made Watchman Nee special is he was not affiliated with any of the denominational churches. And he worshiped with friends in homes. He was really on the vanguard of what became known as the house church movement. This started in Fuzhou, and it continued when he moved to Shanghai. And the Christian Assembly in Shanghai met in the international settlement in there was a series of homes, and they would meet there once a week. It was said that he had around 80,000 people in China who were followers of his. My aunt, who knew Watchman Nee, said that he was a very charismatic person. He wasn't bombastic. He didn't speak from a pulpit. He would speak at the same level as everyone else in the room, and he had a very quiet way of talking about very complicated concepts. And my aunt also said that he could explain things in very simple language. So Watchman Nee, had many followers in China, but he also traveled overseas. And his sermons or his talks were often published in books. So unlike some of the other, indigenous Chinese church leaders, Watchman Nee really had people who were familiar with him and his writing beyond just China. So my grandmother, now that she lived near her brother, she really became interested in what he was doing. And she would go to the Christian assembly on Sundays and, listen to what he was doing and saying. And there came a point where she decided that she would rather go to the Christian assembly than follow her husband on Sundays to St. Peter's, where she was the organist. And so she announced to him that she would no longer do that she was going to stick with her brother and the Christian assembly. And my grandfather, what are you talking about? The reason I know this is they didn't keep it quiet in the household. All the kids heard this fighting, and it created a real schism in the family. And my grandmother was not going to be the dutiful wife and just listen to what her father said. She was following what she believed. And so she started going to the Christian assembly and no longer was playing the organ at St. Peter's. What's interesting is this schism played out, among the children, because my father and his brothers went every Sunday to St. Peter's with their father, and my aunt, Martha, went to the Christian assembly with her mother. This tension was not only in the Lin family, it was playing out in China. And so I read many accounts, like in the Anglican archives, where they would complain about these sheep stealers, they called them. The people like Watchman Nee, Wang Mindao, Zhang Song, these were indigenous religious leaders who also had, following of people. So anyway, it was played out in the Lin family too. And so my grandfather, Watchman Nee was very charismatic, was a wonderful speaker, and my grandfather was not that. He was very stiff at the pulpit, and he was not someone who could just wing it. So anyway, this was the division within the family. 1949. Well, before I get to 1949, the other point I'd like to make about Watchman Nee and my grandfather is they were friends. Watchman Nee would come over to the family, to the house, often for dinners. And my father and his siblings remember so fondly that sometimes on weekends, Watchman Nee would put them in his car and take them for drives, out in the suburbs. And so my grandfather and Watchman Nee, my theory is they were both very intelligent men. And I think they enjoyed each other's company, which might surprise some Watchman Nee scholars out there, but they were very close. 1949, my father was a medical student at St. John's University, and his father, knowing the value of a Western education, basically told his children, if you want to leave, you should leave now. And so my father and his brother left, and another brother and his sister stayed behind. They took literally one of the last boats out of Shanghai. I'm getting one of the time warnings. I have 10 minutes left. Okay, so they got one of the last boats out of Shanghai. They ended up in Hong Kong. Here's an interesting little anecdote. They were in Hong Kong, but the passports that they needed were in Guangzhou. The government was fleeing, in 1949. And so they had to take a ferry up to Guangzhou. And they get to the government office, and there's like a huge line. And so, the man at the counter looks at their name, looks at the spelling of the names, looks at their middle character and says, "Are you the Lins from Fuzhou?" And my grandfather's like, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, well, your cousin works back here." So they were able to get their passports and leave on a charter to the United States. And a month later, my father ends up in Atlantic City, where he was a resident at a hospital. My grandfather understood what was happening in 1949. And at the end of the year, he was a signatory to a letter that was sent to the mission boards, an open letter, a message from Chinese Christians, which said, "The Chinese church will not emerge through this historical change unaffected. It will suffer a purge, and many of the withered branches will be amputated. But we believe it will emerge stronger and purer in quality, a more fitting witness to the gospel of Christ." And so my grandfather signed that letter. What he didn't realize is that he would be one of the withered branches. And there was a new order evolving in China, the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. And my grandfather's mentor, Bishop Y.Y. Tzu, had left China for America and was one of the Chinese Christian leaders who was singled out for denunciation. So my grandfather had to toe the line, and he had to renounce his mentor Y.Y. Tzu from the pulpit. And he, said, "I have experienced an intense internal struggle. I stand here today with incomparable compunction, indignation, and grief. Bishop Y.Y. Tzu, his whole family is now in America, which proves that he has been completely Americanized." This is my grandfather saying this at a, renunciation session. It was also a time of great tension with the United States because of the war that was soon to break out in Korea. So 1952 also marked the arrest of Watchman Nee. He was charged with economic crimes, accused of being a KMT spy, a dissolute vagabond of corrupt and indulgent living, and he was sentenced in 1956 to 20 years in a prison camp. They didn't attack his beliefs, they attacked his character. And so he was sent to a labor camp. 1953, my father married my mother and decided not to return to China. But it was at this time that my grandfather began writing letters to us. My grandfather wrote to us in English every single month, telling us about life in the family home. My Italian mother had the foresight to save all of his letters. So when I was mining the family history, I had these letters to read and also to deconstruct and determine what was he not telling us. The more I learned, the more I can understand what he was holding back. So he wrote, "As you know, I'm not engaged in very active church work now, resting a while, but I find myself engaged with one thing or another every day." So my grandfather, the brilliant scholar, the involved Anglican priest, at age 55 was reduced to babysitting his grandchildren. And he would fill in every now and then. So he was really removed from all of his, church responsibilities, which was really tragic. And again, my father really thought he was just not feeling well. He had a bad heart, and he thought that's why he was slowing down. What's also interesting in the letters, is in November 1966, they switched to Chinese. And, my father, like many overseas Chinese, would send money home. And it would come through Hong Kong. We had an aunt who lived here, Aunt Mary, and the code in the letters was Aunt Mary's gift, her birthday gift. "Did you receive Aunt Mary's birthday gift?" "Yes, we did." Or the letters would say, "I didn't receive Aunt Mary's birthday gift. Where is it?" So she was able to wire money from Hong Kong into Shanghai, but we were not allowed because we didn't have diplomatic relations with China. So in November of 1966, my grandfather wrote in Chinese, Mother and I are being supported by Martha and Tim. I ask you not to send your December birthday gift. Our lifestyle is quite satisfactory. All is well as usual. Please do not worry about us. So, the letters stopped then. And we never really understood why. But, like many families, this was a very, tumultuous time. They were really targeted, and in particular, the Red Guards really took it out on my grandmother. They wanted her to denounce her brother, and she refused. And so they tried to pressure her to do that physically and mentally, and she refused. She never did it. My generation of cousins, many of them turned on her. There was so much pressure within the family. There was one night in August of 1966 where 3 groups of Red Guards came to the family home and ransacked it. My cousin was a pianist. She was studying at the Shanghai Conservatory, and they took away her piano, they destroyed her Deutsche Grammophon records, and burned her sheet music. So for the entire family, it was a very difficult time, but particularly for my grandmother. And that's what my father learned that night in 1979 when we went to Shanghai for the first time. My one cousin on the right here, she really, she was tormented by this whole period, and she ended up going to the countryside to work as a barefoot doctor for 7 years. My cousin Julia was a pianist, and the entire conservatory class was sent to a farm outside of Shanghai where they were planting rice and doing menial farm work like that for a year or so. So for my grandparents, my grandfather was accused of being an American spy. My grandmother was accused of being an enemy of the people. And I know this because in the 1980s, they wanted to, the people had these things called pingfans, where they would try to renew their reputations. And so we do have the paperwork showing that my grandfather was accused of being a spy and my grandmother was a counter-revolutionary. So it was, just a very difficult time for the entire family. It really tore them apart. As you know, the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976 with the death of Mao, and 3 years later, we arrive in China in 1979. And that was the start of this very long journey. It really took me at least 3 decades to pull together the family story and another couple years to write the book. But I left the newspaper business in part because I wanted to finish this book, and I knew I wouldn't be able to if I was working 9 to 5. But I'll never forget when we were in Shanghai in June of 1979, there was an article in the People's Daily, and it said that churches were reopening. And I'll never forget my cousin telling me, it's not going to amount to anything. It's just old people who go to church, and after what we've been through, no one's going to want to go back. So my cousin Victor was wrong. No one knows how many Christians there are in China. It could be 30 million, it could be 100 million. No one really knows because a lot of people choose to express or live their faith privately. So there's no real understanding, but what is known is that the number of Christians is growing. And I contend that one of the reasons is that the foundation was so secure because of people like my grandfather Lin Puqi, his wife Ni Guizhen, and Watchman Nee. And that because of those, that generation of Christians, there was this solid foundation on which to build the church in China. And on that, I will end my talk. Thank you very much. I'm going to get the 1-minute sign, maybe. So I just came in under the wire. So thank you very much.
You beat the clock, Jennifer.
Okay,
there
good.
you go. So that was good. No, thank you, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go now into a time of just question and answer, give a time for you guys to be a part of the conversation and to ask the questions and comments. Just before we do, Jennifer has a few of these copies of the book available. So there's only about 4 or 5 copies, but if you're interested in that, then they'll be available over here, and you can see me about that afterwards. So we're going to go into a question and answer. I think we have some mics that will be roving on both sides. And this can be, questions, comments, basically responses to the talk. Basically what we like to do is to follow kind of a question and answer session. We go by with the ABCs. So the ABC is basically, as you're asking a question, be articulate. So that's the A, because we want to hear what it is that you have to say. So when you have the mic, put it close, and we can hear your question, your thoughts, your comments. The B is be brief, because we want to hear from as many people as possible, obviously. The more we can hear the conversation. So be brief on that. And the C is be centered. Let's get centered on the topics. I'm sure there's probably a lot of ideas that came out of the conversation, but let's try to keep it centered on where the topic is tonight. So the ABCs, basically. So having said that, questions, comments, who would like to kind of start us off on the night? Good. Okay, so we have one in the back, or right here, Drew. Yeah, let's go to Drew, and then we'll go to Daniel in the back there.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful. I was so struck by how much the book reads, in many ways, almost like a screenplay. And so I'm curious, has anyone approached you to start something with Apple?
Nobody, if you want to introduce me to anyone who does. No, but thank you. You know, as I mentioned, my background is journalism, so when I went to sit down and write the book, I intentionally wanted to write it as narrative nonfiction. So if you go to the back of the book, there's lots in the bibliography, there are footnotes, but I write it more as a story. But as a journalist, it's grounded in fact. So anytime you see someone speaking, it's either something that was told to me directly or something I read, you know, in an account. So there's nothing made up. It's all based on fact. But I do try to tell it as a story and put the story of the family in the context of the broader story of what was happening in China for the last 150 years. So.
But you're a filmmaker yourself.
Yeah.
Have you thought about taking it and making a film version?
Well, okay, truth be told, I did have that thought. I thought my grandfather on the ship going to America would be a good way to start the film and pick it up there. But yeah, but you know, they say that period pieces are hard to make as films, but you know, I do think there's a lot of drama there.
Yeah, exactly, and a lot of relationships. Yeah. There's actually a little quote on the front of her book from Connie Chung, which says, a thoroughly gripping historical and personal narrative. So that's quite a quote if you know Connie Chung in that. So thank you, Drew, for that question. Mm-hmm. Daniel in the back.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was absolutely a fascinating story. Thank you so much. I have kind of 1.5 questions. One is, I would love to hear a little bit more about what happened with your grandfather or your grandmother, if that's something you're willing to share here. And then the other is just, I also use Ancestry.com and did quite a bit. I built up my family tree to something like 300 people, I think. But I stopped at the international part. I only did kind of what I could do with the US records. Mm-hmm. So I'd also be curious just to know if you found the international records also to be useful, if that was something you did.
I haven't used the international records at all, just the US ones. And what was your first question? I've already forgotten.
What happened to your, sorry.
Your grandfather.
Yeah, so my grandmother really had a difficult time during the bad years of the Cultural Revolution. So the first few years were the worst, the most violent, and then things calmed down a little bit. But during the really intense period, there were daily, you know, she had to confess her sins and she wouldn't. So, you know, she had to basically, she had to face physical, you know, abuse. So my grandmother died in 1971, and she was not well. You know, there were things that were said in the letters that now that I reread them, they become much more poignant. Like in 1956, June, my grandfather wrote that Mother isn't feeling well. She's in bed and can't get out of bed. And what's missing from that letter is, in 1956 earlier, Watchman Nee was officially, sentenced to 20 years in labor camp, and there were a series of articles in the Liberation Daily attacking him. So it was a difficult time for the whole family. So my grandmother died not very well, and my grandfather, the really good thing Nixon did is opening China, and in 1973 we were able to place a phone call for the first time. We called a public phone in the lane where they lived, and he picked up the phone and we were able to talk to him. And because my grandfather spoke perfect English, we were all able to say something to him. And then like a month or two later, he died. So I never met my grandparents, but this book has brought me so close to my grandfather. Ed, when I set out to research the book, I thought Watchman Nee would kind of eclipse everything because he's such a towering figure. But what I realized is, my grandfather's story really spoke to me. And when I found out he was editor of the school newspaper at St. John's, I thought, there's a connection there.
That's good. Good. Another question over here? Yes.
Thanks. I studied at the local church here for a little while, and I did find the words of Watchman Nee to be absolutely beautiful and very moving, and he was obviously very spiritual. But the movement itself, the local church movement itself, seems to have gone in a very, I would say, separatist way, and they tended to frown upon me, for example, going to the Anglican church at Christmas or whatever, because that's not really seen as proper Christianity. And I just wondered, when you've got the cornerstones of Christianity there, your grandfather and Watchman Nee, obviously very close, have you followed the very recent developments in the local church, as a reporter perhaps, and looked into how those have developed, and is it still a thriving Christian movement, the Christian Assembly, or has it perhaps gone in a bad direction?
I'm going to defer to the scholars in the room who are still keeping track of that. My research ended, in 2015. So a lot has happened in those years, but in what limited research I did on that topic, it was in Fujian, Fuzhou in particular, and what I saw was just there was still a very vibrant house church presence. But in terms of like what has happened recently, I don't know, and I'll be the first to admit that. But I think there are some people here at in the Faith and Global Engagement Center who might be able to answer that question.
We'll defer all those to Daniel. What do you think?
Yes.
Is that one? Sorry. No, that's good. I was very interested that Watchman Nee and your grandfather, even though there was a schism maybe that you described in the family, that they stayed friends and came over for dinner. And was there any correspondence between them or discussions, like theological discussions between them?
Not that I could glean out of my father and his siblings who weren't really paying attention, I don't think. What they remember are the car rides.
Right.
On weekends.
The Uncle Watchman Nee. Taking care of it. Good. Good. Other questions? Yeah, here in the back.
So in your last slide, you've still got it up here, you talked about the work of Watchman Nee and your grandfather and how that formed some of the cornerstones for today. Obviously, another cornerstone of Christianity is the physical church itself. And you had one or two pictures. Did most of the churches, for example, your grandfather and Watchman Nee, survive this period, and are they being used for this day? And I guess as part of your research, did you visit some of these churches and sites as well?
So I mentioned how my research ended in 2015, but what I did is I went back to Fuzhou because I wanted to try to gauge their legacy, and I was happy to see that the Anglican church in Fuzhou is still standing. and everything around it had been bulldozed when I was there. They were clearing out this neighborhood of small homes to make way for development, but the church was still standing. So, you know, I can only talk about that one situation, but I was really pleased to meet the pastor of the church, and also then to separately just visit some of the house churches too.
That's good. Other questions? Yeah, over here. Thanks.
Thank you, Miss Jennifer Lin. I'm not be asking a question, but it's more of a response. I was very touched when you were sharing the story, and truly like what you said, that you, in the beginning of the talk, you said that you discovered that the story of your family is really the story of maybe the Christianity in modern China. So I was reminded by the story because it's really like my family story, because my great-grandfather was converted from a Buddhist to a Catholic. So he was kind of helped by the missionaries there, by missionary doctor. So that's really the start of the faith in my family. And my grand-uncle, one of my grand-uncles, he was a Catholic priest. Now he was put into prison during Cultural Revolution. So I was listening to the talk. I was really touched by the story. And thanks very much for unfolding this story, for unearthing it. I think it's very meaningful. It shows that how the Chinese Christians, they make the faith that receive from the missionary, but they make their own. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you for that. Good. Other questions or comments, thoughts, reactions? Yes. Back to Drew, and then back up to Sukai. There.
Jennifer, I'm curious. When you approached this, and you mentioned that it was like a 3-decade project, and that you were you had to figure out what happened, and it just kept leading you down like further in terms of this rabbit hole. How did you approach that process? Because at some points, I would imagine you could start going off in so many different directions. Where did you start telling yourself, I'm going to stop? And then also, can you describe to us maybe the ebbs and flows, which I imagine may have occurred in terms of trying to take on this project, or were you just wanted to do this all the time? You just had this burning fire to try and figure out how to complete this.
What's really interesting is when we were at this family reunion in 1979, this one uncle was the only one to talk to my father about what happened. His siblings shut down. They did not want to go there because 1979, they weren't convinced that the bad times were over. So in terms of process, you know, what I started was interviewing like the immediate circle of family and actually sitting my father down and saying to him, Dad, tell me the family story. I don't know anything. I grew up in Philadelphia in the 1960s and 70s at a time when, you know, the Vietnam War was going on and people didn't really have a real sense of ethnic identity in America then. I just wanted to be like my best friend who was Ellen O'Brien, Marie Joyce. You know, I wanted to look like her and be like her. But then coming to China, it was like, wow, this is where I come from. So for me, it was, the first step was getting interviews. And eventually my relatives did open up, but it took a very long process of sharing with me their stories because it was very painful. And so my cousin, a friend of my cousin is in the audience. My cousin Julia is a piano teacher in Chicago, and I interviewed her dozens of times, and her mother and her sister Terry, you know, the one who was a barefoot doctor. She was the lost generation in China. You know, the schools closed and her education was thwarted, but she was able to go back to school when they reopened. She ended up immigrating to Australia, getting her master's degree, coming back to China to work for a multinational auto parts company, earning many more dollars than I ever did. And, you know, she really became kind of my navigator. She really helped me to understand not only the past, but the present. And so I approached it in terms of like layers of research. There was the immediate, you know, you want to get those primary interviews with people, but then also like looking at the printed material I had, letters going back to 1953, every single month, and there was a stack of them. So deconstructing those. But again, Watchman Nee was a very prominent person, so there's a lot that has been written about him that I relied on. And then my grandfather was part of the Anglican Church, and the Anglicans are superb record keepers. Their archives are just amazing. And they would have to, every missionary would have to write a letter home, to the home office every year, so I had those to mine. I spent a lot of time in archives. I love archives. And the Shanghai Municipal Archives had all the newsletters from St. Peter's Church in Chinese, but it had some of my grandfather's sermons. So I had those to rely on. Just a wealth of material, really. And I just kept, you have to be tenacious to be a reporter, so I just kept mining it and digging. And I can remember one time interviewing my father. This was like maybe 15 years ago, and my mother yelling from upstairs, "Are you still asking him questions? When does this end?" So really, it never ended. I just decided I had to write.
It's time to put it down.
Yeah, but it wasn't like I was working every single day for 40 years. It was more like whenever I had vacation time, I would go to Birmingham, England to look at the Anglican archives there. When I went to Fuzhou, I think in 2015, I took my daughter and we went up to the gravesite of my great-grandfather, where it was, the I don't know what you call it, but the grave site was covered with weeds, and some of the tender, caretakers had to cut the weeds away in order for us to see it, but you can see, his name still on that. Interesting graveyard story. My grandparents were buried in Suzhou, in a Christian cemetery in Suzhou. The Chinese tradition is to be able to, pay homage to your ancestors. So my uncle transported the remains from China to Los Angeles. So my grandparents are now buried at the Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles. Yes.
It sounds like you were saying earlier, too, that your dad initially just kind of put it in a box, but it sounds like he engaged in the process, too, as you began to...
Well, once I began bugging him, yes. It was just his way of coping.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And he was a surgeon, so it's like you define the problem, you deal with it, and then you move on. So that was his approach. But I think it was really traumatic. But he did sit for all of my interviews whenever I asked. So I have hours and hours of interviews with him. But it's amazing what he couldn't remember. Yeah. Like I remember asking him, "Dad, what was it like when you actually had to flee China in 1949? Because, I saw the movie Empire of the Sun, Steven Spielberg, and it looked like it was chaos." And he said, "I don't remember." And it's like, how can you not remember? So.
Okay, it's good. Suke.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing your family story and for giving this amazing talk. And my grandparents are from Fuzhou, and before moving to Taiwan, and they were Christians active there, and I think it's just amazing to see a glimpse of the Christian life there. 2 generations ago, and I had a question. It struck me when you mentioned when your grandfather was, I guess, being harassed by his local community, and someone offered to help, but he said that this is a matter between Chinese. I was wondering if you might be able to unpack what he might be saying at the point, or what was going through his mind.
Yeah, so this is just my supposition, but I mean, he was singled out because he was recognized as a Chinese person who had ties to Westerners. If the Americans came to his defense, it would have cemented that. And I think he realized it would have hurt him. My grandfather, and I'm not just like supposing this, he wrote about this a lot. he annoyed a lot of people in the missionary community because of his bluntness. But he wrote an article there was a Christian missionary magazine that would go out, the Chinese Recorder. And he wrote how, China needs missionaries, but the right kind of missionaries. Not the missionary who's going to be walled off in their compound, but the missionary who really is part of China and wants to help us as Chinese clerics to basically continue their work. So he was very much, advocating for a transfer of responsibility to the Chinese. That's why he became the first president of Trinity College, Chinese president. There was so much, agitation at that time to do so, and so the Anglicans in Fuzhou finally realized that, and he was the one they selected.
Thanks so much.
Good. Other questions? Yeah. James, right in the middle.
Hi, Jennifer. I'm a firm believer that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, the ones who come before us, and I think hearing your story, that's so true for you. And I'm curious, as you have looked back and spent so much time looking back on the faith of your family, I'm interested in your present and your future, as in many of us have Christian parents and grandparents. Looking at your story, impacted your own faith? And what does that mean for you now? And what choices did you make to kind of follow in the footsteps of these giants?
So I was raised Catholic, and I currently have Catholic beliefs, but I don't belong to any church. I'm from Philadelphia, where Quakerism is very big, and so that's a faith path that interests me very much. I think what I took away from my research is just a sense of awe at the depth of faith of my grandmother and my grandfather. I mean, they faced such obstacles in their life, and yet they were unwavering in their faith. And so, that has really had an impact on me. And I'm still an explorer, I think, spiritual explorer. So I don't know if I've answered your question. It's a difficult one. Yeah. And it's kind of a difficult one to share with an audience. But really, I was profoundly affected by, what I learned about my grandparents and what they went through and what they withstood and their resolve.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's good. Good. Other questions, thoughts? Back to Drew. There you go. That's good.
Drew, you get the prize.
Yeah, I mean, if no one else is going to take it, I'll just keep going.
Just do it. There you go. That's good.
Jennifer, would you mind sharing as well more about how difficult it was for the first missionaries to gather the first converts in China? Yeah. And particularly, also, I'm curious, did your research lead you to any other places beyond Fujian province and the experience of missionaries outside of that area? And then third, were most of them coming from relatively poor backgrounds similar to your family at the time? Or can you help unpack that a little bit?
The converts?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a good question because there's a lot written about that in the, among the Anglican missionaries in Fujian province. There were books and reports on the church mission in Fuzhou, in Fujian province, in like the first missionary arrived, it's in my book, I can't remember the exact date, but like 1860, let's just say then. And it took them 10 years to get one convert. The problem is, they were in Fuzhou, which was one of these centers within China where they would do the annual testing. So there was the literati. There were many scholars who were in Shanghai and Fuzhou, and they really didn't take kindly to the missionaries showing up and trying to tell them the better way. So in some of these books about what was happening in Fuzhou, they did lament the fact that they weren't converting a whole heck of a lot of people. John Wolfe, Archdeacon John Wolfe, the Moses of Fujian, he shows up, and he had a very different background than some of the other missionaries. He was a simple man from Ireland, and he believed that for them to be effective, they really needed to get out of the city. And so there was a real effort among the early Anglican missionaries in Fujian to go to the villages. So again, there are books where they describe going to these different communities all around Fujian province. And the one where my family is from, where the Lin Ancestral Hall is, it's Ardu. Back then they would refer to it in the local language as Nitu, I think it was. And so there are descriptions of Archdeacon Wolfe going to this community and interacting with people and what the reaction was. There was also a mention in one of these things that I read how in this very village where my great-great-grandfather was from, there was a Christian who was killed because there would be these backlashes against them. And it was soon after that the fisherman left, with his son on his back, So it was very difficult. My research was mostly around Fujian province in Shanghai. My grandfather spent a year in Kaifeng, which is a very interesting place because there were Jews in Kaifeng, but he was at a middle school there. So I really limited myself. In my reading, I did a lot of reading about the Anglican experience. I've read about that. But as far as on the ground work, it was mostly Fujian province. And did you have a third question, or did I answer them both?
I may have forgotten them actually.
I've already forgotten.
You're giving a great answer.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. I think we'll go back to Daniel in the back there.
Thanks. Steve, if I violate any of your ABCs on this one, please let me know.
You're doing fine,
It's
Daniel.
more of a reflection than a question. But I'd like to go back to one of the slides you posted, which I took a picture of, and I'll just read it out again for context. The Chinese church will not emerge from this historical change unaffected. It will suffer a purge, and many of the withered branches will be amputated. But we believe it will emerge stronger and purer in quality, a more fitting witness to the gospel of Christ. This put me in mind of a book I read a few months ago on the experience of the Russian church. It's called Russia's Catacomb Church, or Russia's Catacomb Saints. And it was written by a Russian man on all of the experience of the suffering of the priests, bishops, lay people under communism in Russia. And it was translated by an American Orthodox priest named Seraphim Rose, who died in 1982. And I'm mentioning the dates. He translated this work, and the motto he put at the beginning of the book was, this is dedicated to Russia's Catacomb Saints. Yesterday in Russia, tomorrow in America. And he had something of a prophetic view of the potential trials and things that American Christianity, perhaps Western Christianity, would go through in the future. And in light of the Cultural Revolution, some of these events that take a certain path that I don't think anyone would have expected. Just looking at the experience of China and also looking at the experience of Russia, it will be interesting to see what goes on in America and the West in terms of how Christianity is treated, because I think it is under a kind of threat from a cultural revolution type of mentality. So anyway, that's just my reflection.
Comment. Good. You kept it on the ABCs too, so that was good. Thanks, Daniel. Any other comments, thoughts we want to share? Yes, right here in the end of the row. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Jennifer. I just have a question that I was curious about, if you also managed to speak some of the local Fuzhou people. By any chance they know of your great-great-grandfather, and then what did they say about him being an American spy, like the local Fuzhou people?
I didn't talk to them about that, but he's still very well known. like in Fuzhou, when I went to the church where he was the dean of this church, they remembered him. He is remembered. He's not as towering a figure as Watchman Nee, but among the Anglicans who are still, or people who know the Anglican history, they know him and his contribution. So, but yeah, I mean, he was not an American spy, but he did have sons who lived in America, so that didn't help him. And they knew that he was in constant contact with them, so.
I thought it was kind of interesting when you were talking about the, how there's a point where you decided to write those letters once a month, almost like you said,
Yeah.
okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to record this on a really regular basis.
Yeah, but the letters are very superficial.
Yeah.
They're very
Okay.
happy.
Yeah.
He talks about the rose bush out front is in bloom. We had a really nice dinner. We went to Lushan, that sort of thing. They were very, very superficial.
Superficial.
Yeah.
You couldn't go through. No, it's interesting.
And they were funny too, because sometimes my grandfather would correct my father's writing. He was, forever the teacher.
The teacher?
Yeah.
The journalist?
So
Kinda working on it,
my
right?
father misspelled the word drooling. For some reason, he had drooling, and my grandfather said, "There's no word what you wrote."
Tough pass. Okay, good. Well, we'll stay around for a little bit if people want to come up afterwards and follow up with any other questions that they would like to ask for Jennifer as well. Again, I have the books here. See me if you're interested in one of those. Maybe, Jonathan, we can go to the next slide. I'll just kind of wrap up briefly with just some things that are coming in Faith and Global Engagement. So actually, next Wednesday night, we kind of continue on in this theme in terms of Christianity in the Chinese way. So we're very blessed to have two scholars with us, one Chloe Starr from Yale, and then also Ping Yin from Boston University. So they'll be here kind of doing a double header on the stage next week, talking about really this whole idea of somehow Christianity sometimes looked at as a Western religion, but what is the real influence there? So they'll be kind of addressing that topic together. And then you can see going on in January and February, Michael Lindsay's going to be here talking about leadership. And then Francis Su is going to be with us in February talking about flourishing and mathematics. And that is not a typo. Yes, flourishing and mathematics can go together. And so Francis Su is going to be talking about that in there. So there's a few things coming on. If you're not on our list, then you can just go on our website, and it's really easy. Just put your name and your email, and that's about all it takes to get on our mailing list, and we can keep you updated as things go along. But Jennifer, any last thought, word that you would want to share with us?
Just thank you for being here. It's so wonderful to see an audience of this size on a Friday night. So thank you very much.
Well, that's good. Well, let's give Jennifer a warm appreciation. She is a longtime friend of Hong Kong. It's been 2015 since you've been here before.
Yep.
Come back again quickly.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.